Greetings, friends of liberty. We here in the 18th century, as I speak, are afflicted with any number of tortured belief systems which you call ideologies. That of the Catholics, prominent on the continent, and here in England that of the Anglicans, all with their varied self-deceptions. Of the virgin birth, can you imagine anything so silly as a god needing to be born of a virgin? Holy Communion, with its host, the wafer and wine, somehow magically transformed into the actual body and blood of their Lord and Savior, and their fantasies of heaven and hell, for the good and bad amongst us. No. Justice is either found in this world, or 'tis never, ever found. But you too, in the 21st century, as modern as you are, also live in an age of many ideologies produced by your ideology factories, your universities, not the least of which is represented by those activists Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Miss Greta Thunberg, and finally Al Gore and Barack Obama, who all say they believe a climate catastrophe is imminent. In this book, Fossil Future, energy expert and objectivist philosopher Alex Epstein assembles one of the greatest arguments ever made against the green ideology, represented by AOC, the Swedish green Joan of Arc, and our two vice presidential and presidential Harvardians. Encyclopedic in breadth, Epstein methodically and exhaustively deconstructs the numerous rationalizations and self-deceptions Greens habitually use to defend their ideology and to attack the continued use of fossil fuels. After an introductory section, Alex lays out his climatological argument in two main parts. He shows how Greens ignore the benefits of fossil fuels and how they catastrophize the side effects. Let's examine each. Ignoring the benefits. Were you aware that the daily electricity use of 3/8 of the world's population is less than that of a refrigerator? And thus, all the benefits of all the appliances they could add represent an enormous potential increase in human well-being. That would translate into more incubators, so infants can survive in Kenya, more ultrasound machines so they can detect fetal abnormalities in Nigeria, more lights so children can study, and more washing and other machines so women will have enough free time to become more skilled and educated throughout the developing world. So how does a society such as ours remain oblivious to these benefits? Partially by first taking over the knowledge system of a country, a process on which some of my own videos have focused. This knowledge system ranges from institutions like our universities with their departments of meteorology, atmospheric and climatic science, to NASA and the National Academy of Sciences, to science journals like Nature and the International Journal of Climatology, to the Fourth Estate, CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times, and finally to those alleged celebrity energy experts like occasional Cortex, Miss Greta, and the bozo of Beacon Hill, John Kerry. This is our knowledge, or we might say pseudo-knowledge system, at work. How do we know there's a bias in it? From Michael the man's man to Titanic's Leonardo? Well, one way is by checking to see what's in the actual Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, reports versus what's highlighted in their summaries for the press. Big difference in, for example, societal susceptibility to droughts, storms, or floods, all of which are prognosticated by scientists in the actual report as being low in the future, which aren't even mentioned in the IPCC press summaries. I wonder why. The reality is that climate prediction is enormously difficult, as evidenced by the fact that hindcasting, trying to show that your theory can predict the past, doesn't work well. Additionally, most modern climatologists err on the side of warming, which can be seen in their bad predictions, since approximately 97% overpredicted the amount of warming that has occurred in the 21st century. 97%. That is bias. Another way is by admitting the facts on how much safer our societies have increasingly become, especially over the last century, using the International Disaster Database. So, for example, regarding general climate disasters, they measured about 2,400 deaths per million in the 1920s and are less than 50 per million now. Regarding droughts, deaths have decreased by over 98%. With storms, the worldwide rate has decreased from about 60 per million to less than 5. And finally, with floods over the last half century, the worldwide danger has decreased from almost 10 to 7. So then the next question is, what standard or criterion is motivating all these celebrity skeptics of fossil fuels and even scientists themselves? And the answer, Alex says, is that they're anti-human, and that means anti-human impact. Anything that we do as a species that impacts the natural world, they're against. Against nuclear and hydropower, for example, even though these forms of energy are low carbon and safe for humans. So anti-impact is the best way to understand their actual existential goals. And what's the result of a knowledge system spreading its anti-impact philosophy? That many, perhaps most people, just by listening to and reading the news, they think the world is getting worse and worse, and sometimes poorer and poorer, when in actuality it's been getting better over the last century. So, for example, the number of people in extreme poverty was 1.9 billion in 1990, and is forecast to be less than 100 million in 2030. That enrichment being largely driven by fossil fuel use. Yet another way, Alex claims, is when economists do studies trying to add up both the positive and negative side effects of the use of fossil fuels, called positive and negative externalities. An enormous mistake here habitually made is not adding up the increased productivity of agriculture from the greater airborne CO2 fertilization of plants, which has resulted in a net greening of forests around the world as CO2 has increased. Bjorn Lomborg's estimate, an area twice the size of Australia increased. In addition, relatedly, skeptics fail to mention the increased crop productivity again from that airborne CO2 to the tune of 12% or more. Another unreported beneficial side effect is the fact that cold is more deadly than heat to humans, which is why so many Americans move to Florida and Arizona, not Minnesota and Maine. How much more deadly? Bjorn Lomborg says in England there are 33 cold deaths to every heat death, a number you won't hear from Greta. It should be noted, Alex has a creative talent for developing his own set of terms which enable him to make succinct, powerful arguments, or on social media, talking points, which he can very quickly and effectively transmit vital points of understanding. Here are some of his terms. Machine food. Fuel. And so the cheaper that machine food is, the more machines we can have, like cows in a field producing milk for us to do our bidding. Resource mastery. Actually, resource creation, as oil had no value to the pre-Columbian Native Americans. Delicate nurturer. The green idea that Gaia is incredibly delicate and easily destroyed and becomes hysterical when thrown from her natural climactic equilibrium. Wild potential. The potential the Earth holds for all of us only if we can master it technologically and scientifically. Human flourishing framework. The full context criterion for evaluating any technology by whether it helps humanity in flourishing. Unnatural livability. So because of the many machines that increase our productive ability throughout the whole economy, our well-being is unnatural and artificial. A typical example being how much cleaner our streets are now than 150 years ago, when they were filled with equine and human excrement, both liquid and solid, rotting food, animal carcasses, and old furniture. Think of a huge third world garbage dump. So how did we get from there to here? Garbage trucks, sewers built by excavators, and treatment plants all run by fossil fuels. That's unnatural livability. Finally, his term climate mastery. Our ability to master climate, typical examples being central heating on the one hand and air conditioning on the other. 2,000 people dying in 1911 in New England during a heat wave without air conditioning. And the external climate, that of dams, controlling water flow and irrigation, or international transportation during droughts and famines, which allow us to significantly alleviate the effects. Or, as Joe Rogan suggests, for water, the desalination of the Pacific Ocean. Thus, with increasing fossil fuel use comes increasing climate mastery, which is all for the good. Which means that fossil fuels can help us overcome the bad effects of fossil fuels. A typical example being present and future forms of nuclear energy, their research and construction powered by fossil fuels. Now, if only citizens can see this and stop allowing politicians and bureaucrats and the tie-dyed from criminalizing nuclear, as they've done for the last half century. Now to Alex's second section, catastrophizing the side effects. Alex's next major point, the one that everyone has been waiting for, is that the only conceivable reason not to use fossil fuels is if they might result in some very large climate effects, like Greens claim will happen. And so Alex then proceeds to show their improbability. Why? Because, as everyone here, who undoubtedly has watched all of Disney's Ice Age movies, has learned, climate is controlled by very many other factors than CO2, as illustrated by the fact that during the early Middle Ages, the Vikings had vineyards on Greenland. No CO2 then, AOC. And so this means that at least some of the warming that we've experienced over the last centuries may be due to other factors, such as various sun or climate cycles, and the fact that the Little Ice Age, which has peaked around 1750, has now stopped. It should be noted that CO2 levels have been at times 10 times higher than in the past without posing any apparent difficulty to life on Earth. Other problems? The rise of sea levels? Only about 1.5 feet per century. Ocean acidification? Not a problem. Wildfires? Partly their frequency is decreasing around the world, but in the US and Australia, it's increasing due to governmental policies which prevent regular controlled burning, reducing fuel loads. So it's precisely the Greens who have, in both Australia and the US, increased the frequency of forest fires with their disregard for human and natural well-being. And here the left claims to love indigenous people and animals, but in the US, what the Indians did was to periodically burn vast areas of forests to ensure low fuel loads and increase game populations. They were a lot smarter than Greens. In conclusion, I would give Alex's argument, being enormously insightful, comprehensive, and well-crafted, an A+. But the book, an A-, taking off slightly because I could have given this argument the same punch in 200 instead of 430 pages. Alex repeatedly making arguments from the ground up and being very explicit in every step of his reasoning, as objectivists tend to be. Additionally, being used to the style of the skeptical environmentalist, the statistician Bjorn Lomborg, more numbers would have been more satisfying. On that overall admiring note, I bid you well and remain as ever the Scarlet Pimpernel.